So let's welcome three political observers to talk about the Public Safety Minister and more as we near Parliament's summer break. With me in studio is Tim Powers, Chair of SUMA Strategies. Also joining us is Susan Smith, a principal with Blue Sky Strategy Group, and Mélanie Richer, a senior consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies. Good to see all three of you.
Good to be here.
Nice to see you.
Susan, let me start with you. Marco Mendicino says he should have been briefed on Paul Bernardo's transfer. He says that he's dealt with it internally, that he's going to now make some changes to how the minister gets notified. But at the end of the day, can Marco Mendicino stay in his position as a public safety minister?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. A couple things. First of all, this is horrible what's happened, particularly for the Mahaffey and French families. There's no question. Anytime Paul Bernardo's name comes up, it must send shivers of pain down their spines because it sends shivers down the spines of everybody else. There was clearly a gross lack of communication when it came to this file. If his staff was briefed, they should have told the minister. I also think there was a failure on the part of the correctional services to brief the minister or to assure that the minister had been briefed, as well as the deputy there. I think there's failure all the way along. It was clear to me when I watched Mr. Mendicino's news conference this week that he heard about it when he heard about it, not before. It was the day after, like everybody else, and was shocked. But there's clearly been some failure there, and he's taken measures to rectify it in terms of issuing ministerial edicts to say from now on, victims' families must be notified, and the minister must be notified when it's people people with criminal records, like the horrible person in question. I don't even like to say the guy's name; he's such a bad person. So I think we've all heard rumors that there'll be a shuffle at some point this summer, and I would expect that Mr. Mendicino would be part of that shuffle.
Okay, so Tim, even Liberal MPs we're hearing saying, look, there's a problem with how information is moving through the government. Who do you think is dropping the ball here?
Look, I don't like to blame staff because ultimately the minister and ministers are responsible for all of that. Susan and I have been ministerial staff, and I know the ministers Susan and I worked with in different governments would have been apoplectic and taken a very different approach had this befallen them. Look, clearly the government has some internal management challenges, and that's not said from a partisan perspective. I like Marco Mendicino, Andrew. I think he's a very decent fellow, but though my liking and his decency doesn't excuse a lack of ministerial accountability here. In a different era, this may have been met with a resignation. I agree with Susan. I don't think Marco stays in this portfolio. He's politically important to the Liberals because he's very good on the ground. But the bigger challenge for the Liberals, beyond the clear cultural challenges they're having internally around managing the government, is this just keeps adding on to the image they're projecting. And we found it in recent Abacus polls of people viewing them as incompetent, and this is making more people look at the government and say, do we want to re-elect them? And right now in our Abacus poll, Andrew, 80% of Canadians say they want a change of government. This sort of stuff doesn't help the government, it reinforces that desire.
Mélanie, let me bring you in. Jagmeet Singh and the NDP have not followed the Conservatives in demanding Mendicino's removal, but he is saying, to Tim and Susan's point, the government is having problems with information sharing. So to your mind, is this a failure of the minister or the minister's staff or the public service?
Well, I think there's probably enough blame to lay around here. This is obviously a huge mistake, and if this isn't the first minister's mistake either. I am from the point of mind, though, that continuously asking for ministers to be fired. Not that it's not important that those ministers are accountable, but I think it removes the blame from the Prime Minister and it removes the blame from the government. And I think that there is blame here to be had by the Prime Minister and his office. It almost seems like the government is incapable to get ahead of stuff and to get a handle on stuff to really reassure Canadians. Yes, on this issue, but on many issues. So to Tim's point of maybe this isn't, a one issue thing that's going to change the voters' minds in the next election, but the series of issues that the government has been unable to get a good handle on, I think is going to be something that folks are really reflecting on before they cast their next vote.
Okay, so let's move to another issue then, which is the foreign interference story and how that's developed. So We have David Johnston saying late last week, I'm stepping down as special rapporteur because of a highly partisan atmosphere. And then you have the government accusing the opposition parties of being toxic. Now we have the government and Dominic LeBlanc saying, look, an inquiry is still on the table, that he's willing to hear from opposition leaders. Susan, at least on the surface, there seems to have been a small pivot in tone. What do you make of what we've been seeing over the past few days?
Well, I think Mr. Johnston made the right move in the end. I was on the record from the beginning saying I think a public inquiry would be a good idea, though I'm not sure people are going to be as satisfied as they'd like to be. How wide open the national security kimono is going to be, but I do think it would be beneficial. I think the government has made a good move in saying to the opposition, or potentially a good move, saying to the opposition, okay, let's work together on the terms of reference. Let's work together on finding someone that you guys think is acceptable. Dominic LeBlanc is always never at a loss for words. And I think he said, after you put David Johnston through the snowblower, I'm not sure who's going to step up to take on that role, because it is a toxic parliamentary environment. And I don't think Mr. Poilievre in particular is really looking to try to get any answers on foreign interference. I think he's just looking to score political points. So we need to make sure that whatever happens actually achieves what it needs to, and that reinforces the faith of Canadians in our democracy. And I think the government's realized that, by involving the opposition, they did try to at the beginning, and the opposition rebuffed. But now the ball is clearly in the court of the opposition to work with the government on terms of reference on some kind of next steps, probably a public inquiry. I think Mr. Poilievre can only complain so long, and Mr. Singh will hopefully participate in the process and give constructive input into something that provides results that Canadians are looking for.
Okay, so Mélanie, let me get your thoughts on this, because as Susan says, the government is now saying to the opposition parties, look, come back to us with a timeline, with some potential names, with a scope. How do you think the NDP, the Bloc Québécois, the Conservatives should be reacting to this?
Well, I think when it comes to the NDP, I think they've really stricken a good balance throughout this whole issue of foreign interference. They have been demanding transparency. They've been asking for the answers that Canadians rightfully deserve, but haven't done it in a way where it is solely partisan, where it's only I'm trying to tear stuff down because I'm trying to tear stuff down, like we've seen Poilievre do. So I think Jagmeet in particular has really struck the right balance of trying to keep the government accountable, but on an issue that is too important to just turn it into a partisan circus. So I think he's really had the right tone on this. As it relates to what kind of cooperation we can see from the opposition on who could do this work. To Susan's point, I don't know who puts their hand up and says, I want to do this after everything that we've just seen. So I think it's going to be difficult to come to that agreement. And the closer that we get to the summer, the closer that we get to the fall, we're getting really close to when the next election is going to be. So do we even have the results of that potential inquiry before the next one, so that Canadians are reassured that our democracy and our elections are protected is hard to say at this point.
And Tim, so what are the stakes then for the government, for Mr. Trudeau, and for the official opposition, Mr. Poilievre, who has kind of been leading the process? He's saying, I've been meeting with the Bloc leader. I'm going to make contact with Jagmeet Singh and Elizabeth May.
For the opposition, I think they do have to look like they're part of the process of finding a solution, but ultimately the opposition, I think, will not receive the heavier judgment on this, Andrew. It is up to the government to decide where to go next. And this plays into the narrative of the last story. Government not on top of a key file involving foreign interference. So the government at some point is going to have to take and make some direction here, whether they can find people to do this or not. I mean, this remains a challenge. But to be fair to all concerned, and I think you're seeing this more in the debates of the House today, this isn't driving voter intention. This is not, it registers as a story, it registers around Mr. Johnson, but the top three issues in voters' mindsets, number 1, 2, or 3, are not foreign interference. So the government has some room there on that front.
Okay, well, we have to leave it there. Tim Powers, Susan Smith, and Mélanie Richer, thanks to all three of you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Andrew.